Trump has now finally, inevitably, inescapably, and overtly threatened to shut down the free press in this country. Repeated that threat in a speech at Detroit, and then descended in the same speech to meandering gibberish, the kind of incoherence that would get you institutionalized whether you were 28 or, like him, 78. First, the threat to news. 60 Minutes is a major part of the news organization of CBS, which has just created the greatest fraud in broadcast history. CBS should lose its license, and it should be bid out to the highest bidder, as should all other broadcast licenses, because they are just as corrupt as CBS, and maybe even worse. Another Trump post reads, "A fake news scam, which is totally illegal. Take away the CBS license." Once again, he means this. The intent is to punish, to bankrupt, to prosecute anybody who criticizes him. That includes CBS, that includes me, and like all totalitarians and dictators, that threat to destroy critics will soon or late include you. He wants to punish 60 Minutes and CBS because he did an interview with Kamala Harris, even after he chickened out of the interview with them to which he had agreed. In his mindless rage, Trump believes his cowardice and his dishonesty is not the problem, but that CBS underscoring his cowardice and his dishonesty is the problem. But there is within this threat something almost as frightening. As I've mentioned before, CBS does not have a license. News organizations do not have licenses. Individual over-the-air TV and radio stations have licenses. But if he somehow really managed to take their licenses, CBS television would still exist. So would 60 Minutes. So would CBS News. He does not understand this. He is wrong about it. And as we have seen for a decade, when he is wrong, there is only one way out. What he is wrong about must be changed so that he is right about it after all. What Trump is saying, one way or the other, is if he regains power, there will be licenses for news organizations, and the Constitution be damned.
The other big news is the fraud committed by 60 Minutes and CBS, together with the Democrat Party, working together with them, which will go down as the single biggest scandal in broadcast history, I predict. It's a big story. I don't know if you've seen it yet. Happened. They learned about it yesterday evening.
Trump's speech to the Economic Club of Detroit. And how stupid are these people that they don't know that there are no news licenses? The speech did not stop there. Before he again tried to bribe voters with something preposterous and financially disastrous, in this case making all automobile loan payments fully tax deductible, he raged over Monday's piece in the New York Times that tiptoed around his mental condition and cited his continuing obsession with a non-existent Michigan Man of the Year award as some of the evidence of his cognitive decline. Trump, in the speech, said his staff had finally found the proof that he was right. He pulled from his pocket a computer printout of an article from a small Michigan paper, the Oakland Press. Quote, "It was like 19 years ago. It was a long time, but I was honored, and guess what? They found it. I was. So here's your article right here. Oakland County GOP to honor Donald Trump, former president, to speak at upcoming Lincoln Day fundraising dinner." Former president? From 19 years ago? The article is from June of 2023. It references a local dinner from 2013. Trump says it proves he was Michigan's Man of the Year in 2005 or 2004. Trump has the year wrong, the decade wrong, the award wrong, and the geography wrong. He was very happy about this. He is very, very sick. What's worse, the paper has now deleted and corrected its account even at that dinner in 2013 that they wrote about in 2023. There was no Man of the Year award, not even just Man of the Year in Oakland County. Trump literally does not remember what he got wrong then or what he is getting wrong now. And this was before his speech descended into madness. Trump has taken to calling his inability to focus on any 1, 2, or 20 topics at a time weaving, and there is some evidence that he often hears the connections, others don't, as his mind wanders around like a Roomba. Yesterday in Detroit, though, there seemed a new suggestion that even he no longer knows what he is talking about or what he has been trying to talk about. This seemed to have started with factory closings. God knows where it ends.
It's a very big plant. Many countries, they do that, and then all of a sudden you hear that they're leaving Milwaukee or they're leaving wherever they may be located. It's very sad to see it. And it's so simple. I mean, this isn't like Elon with his rocket ships that land within 12 inches on the moon where they wanted to land. Or he gets the engines back. That was the first I said, who the hell did that? I saw engines about 3-4 years ago. These things were coming, cylinders, no wings, no nothing. And they're coming down very slowly, landing on a raft in the middle of the ocean someplace with a circle. Boom. Reminded me of the Biden circles that he used to have, right? He'd have 8 circles and he couldn't fill them up. But then I heard he beat us with the popular vote. I don't know. Couldn't fill up the 8 circles. I always loved those circles. They were so beautiful. They were so beautiful to look at. In fact, the person that did them, that was the best thing about the level of that circle was great. But they couldn't get people, so they used to have the press stand in those circles because they couldn't get the people. Then I heard we lost. Oh, we lost. No, we're never going to let that happen again. But we've been abused by other countries. We've been abused by our own politicians, really more than other countries.
As Dan Aykroyd said while portraying the chef Julia Child on Saturday Night Live years ago as she lost consciousness due to a cut while preparing a chicken, "Save the liver! I remember when I was a little girl." And worse was yet to come. As an aside, this actually might have been the highlight of Trump's speech.
This is a catastrophe for the American dream and a dire crisis from commerce to labor to FEMA.
There are no words, yet Trump still said them. Again, bluntly, nothing President Biden has ever said, not in the worst moments of the debate, approached that. This is how you sound as the anesthesia begins to take effect, or the dementia, or the drugs, or the booze, or the stroke. That this ever more rapid loss of coherence is not getting the publicity it should, nor that the 1/100th as disturbing hesitations of President Biden did, is the crisis of this campaign. Trump is going crazy before the media's eyes, and the media is virtually ignoring it. And the combination of the media cowering and Trump's inability to function rationally and his rage at anybody criticizing him, especially about his inability to function rationally, that can be fatal to this country. Just yesterday, the Washington Post scooped that early this year on a strategy conference call, a Trump aide named James Blair was asked how to fight back against news stories that said the campaign's get out the vote effort was insufficient. Blair was quoted by the Washington Post as replying, "We are going to beat the reporters into retardation," unquote. The real problem is that there remains the possibility that Trump will not remember the CBS license idiocy after whatever next enrages him does enrage him. The real problem is that this goon Blair might have merely been being metaphorical on that call. The real problem is that prospective Trump Attorney General Mike Davis might be, as he claims, just trolling Democrats when he explains he wants to imprison reporters at Guantanamo Bay or in a gulag somewhere. That could all be true. But the real problem is the Trump cultists who hear these threats do not take them metaphorically. Politico's Adam Wren profiled this Mike Davis and his, quote, trolling, unquote. Wren now writes that at the Republican Nazi convention this summer, he was permitted by Davis to shadow him. They went to a hotel bar where Trump's idiot sons and hangers-on were waiting to laud Davis. He writes, quote, "As I pecked notes on my phone, a woman who had told us to stop staring scolded me for chronicling the exchange and began recording me. She demanded that I delete the notes or give her my phone. When I tried to leave, she recruited 4 men to block the elevators. They stared menacingly at me and demanded I turn over my phone or delete my notes. I was trapped. I wouldn't delete my notes, and I was getting nervous. I called Mike Davis, who had disappeared. He asked me where I was, and I told him. I explained to the woman I had to catch a flight to go home to my family in the next few hours. Quote, 'You should have thought about your kids before you did what you did,' she replied. After roughly 15 minutes of this standoff," he writes, "I searched for another exit. I ran down a hallway into a stairwell. 2 people followed me. When I was out on the street, Davis called me. By this point, Davis had confronted the aide near the elevators and dressed her down. 'You don't ask a reporter to delete their notes,' he told her." According to both Davis and a second person he recounted his remarks to briefly after, "This isn't North Korea," unquote. This isn't North Korea. Not yet. And that it is not North Korea, not yet, is not Trump's doing. And there is the flip side of the same thing, threatening licenses, threatening networks, threatening journalism, threatening the First Amendment, threatening reporters again and again and day after day, makes them censor themselves in advance, makes them cooperate in advance, makes them weary of just the thought of the confrontation. And it is measurable. There are metrics. Media Matters analyzed coverage in the LA Times, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and the Washington Post. How many stories were written in the week after Judge Chutkan unsealed Jack Smith's filing in the Trump coup case, the week that ended on Wednesday? 26 stories in those 5 major papers. How many stories were written in the same 5 newspapers in the week after the James Comey letter 8 years ago this month about Hillary Clinton's emails? 100. 100 email stories, 26 Jack Smith filing stories. Literally 4 times as much coverage in some of the supposedly liberal newspapers of this country. But her emails. Ominously, Judge Chutkan now says she will release Smith's second filing, the supporting evidence for his first filing, delaying it for a week to give Trump a chance to investigate litigation to stop it. When she releases the evidence, let's see if those 5 newspapers give this the same 1/4 of the coverage. Because the phrase "but her emails" is now paired in reporters' and editors' minds with the phrase, "but Trumpists will threaten me." A quick polling roundup. 2 fascinating interior numbers from the Ipsos poll for Reuters. Harris reverses Trump's leads in suburbs and among middle-class voters. Reuters Ipsos polls show. I'm indebted to my former colleague Carl Quintanilla for doing this. Exclusive, Harris up 47-41 among suburban voters, 9 points better than Biden. Harris up 45-43 in households earning $50,000 to $100,000 per year, also 9 points better than Biden. Now, the other stuff I have mentioned before. You should expect, down the stretch, a flood of bad, cooked pro-Trump polls. They not only are there to screw up the polling averages, but the more outlandish ones like Trump +2 by ActiVote, like Trump in Rasmussen up way over Biden, they are there to serve as props if Trump loses and when he tries to foment violence. And he pulls another article from his pocket, as he did in Michigan yesterday, and screams, "But I was winning in all the polls." The other purpose is to screw with the heads of Democrats. It's working. Social media is awash with Trump is gaining. What are we going to do? The 538 polling average is Harris 48.4, Trump 46.0. That is Harris by 2.4 points. On the 25th of last month, it was Harris by 2.6 points. On August 11th, it was Harris by 2.3 points. The polling average at the Split Ticket website is Harris by 2.7 points. On the 8th of September, it had been Harris by 2.6. Getting the point here? She's ahead by a little. She's ahead by a little less. She's ahead by a little more. She needs to be ahead by even more. This was true the day she took over the ticket, and it was true most of the days since. It's around 2.5. And yes, there are even some badly done, or less sympathetically, perhaps even deliberately badly done polls being mixed in there now, even by reputable outlets. Perhaps the most panic in the past week was after a TIPP poll for American Greatness. They've done pretty good work nationally, but they did for Pennsylvania. A poll that showed Harris trailing Trump by 1.5 among likely voters. As Professor Aaron Astor of Maryville College noted, and several polling experts agreed, going diving into the crosstabs is rarely anything more than the equivalent of sticking your finger down your throat or emulating the Trumpists looking for an excuse. But it turns out that in the crosstabs for the TIPP Pennsylvania poll, there is one genuinely shocking bit of polling malpractice. In the same poll, in the same state in which TIPP concludes Trump leads Harris by 1.5 among likely voters, their data shows him trailing her. Kamala Harris ahead by 4 points in Pennsylvania among registered voters. Do you know what you have to do to make your own poll swing 5.5 points towards Donald Trump? You'd have to, eliminate virtually all voters from Philadelphia from your likely voter Pennsylvania sample, which is exactly what TIPP did. The crosstabs show this. There were 134 voters from Philadelphia among TIPP's registered voters for Pennsylvania. When they refined this and sorted them out into likely voters and not likely voters and the weighted averages here and the non-weighted averages there, it went from 134 voters in Philadelphia in the registered voters count that had Harris ahead by 4 to 12 voters from Philadelphia in the likely voters poll that has Trump ahead by 1.5. That's a lot. That's eliminating 9/10 of the voters from the biggest Democratic city in the state and one of the biggest Democratic cities in the country. So much for the TIPP poll of Pennsylvania. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say they may have made that one to be stuffed into Trump's jacket pocket. On that one, at least, take a deep breath. Quick correction here. I mentioned yesterday that the grandfather of Looney Tunes Florida Congresswoman and ex-Maxim model Anna Paulina Luna, real name Anna Meyerhofer, was drafted into the Nazi World War II Air Force, the Wehrmacht. I want to apologize to Congresswoman Luna for my appalling mistake. Her grandfather was not drafted into the Nazi Air Force. The Nazi Air Force was the Luftwaffe. Her grandfather was drafted into the Nazi military, the Wehrmacht. So I apologize. Congresswoman Luna's grandfather was not a Nazi flyer. He was just a Nazi soldier. Also of interest here, Carrie Lake thinks nephews are girls and says so at her debate. And she thinks that the miracle that parents turn to help bring them to life is called UVF. The Ulster Volunteer Army, I guess? Or did she mean UVA at the University of Virginia? If you're going to take somebody from television and run them for senator, never, ever, ever make it the ex-weekend weather person. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
Let me peel back the curtain for a second. I don't think the man whose voice you just heard there, the Hall of Famer Larry David, will object to this. But twice in the last 2 weeks, he and I have corresponded by email about this music. It is the Toccata and Fugue by Bach. And to Larry's great surprise, and Larry has been a supporter and friend of mine for almost 20 years now, and I have appreciated every moment of his support, every moment of his friendship, and I might add, if you ever get a chance to actually sit down with him, he is the most delightful audience you will ever meet. He will laugh at almost anything that is slightly funny. As the great humorists tend to be, he's an easy laugh. Having put that aside, Larry emailed me with some urgency and astonishment because, watching a New York Yankees playoff game on TV, he heard this. Playing at a critical moment, the Bach Toccata and Fugue, playing in a critical moment at Yankee Stadium during a ball game, and he wanted to know if indeed his ears were playing tricks on him, if the Yankees were suddenly playing the music, the organ music from my podcast. I am delighted that it has now taken on that name. I think the composer Bach had something to do with it much earlier. And now we push the curtain back with thanks to Larry for bringing that up. Jim Bouton, my late friend who wrote Ball 4, the best baseball book ever written, said that after a few years, his youngest child, a few years of going to baseball games, heard the national anthem played at a parade or a rodeo or something like that and said, "Dad, they're playing the baseball song." Wonderful. Still ahead of us on this edition of Countdown, it may seem as if we just got stupid in the last 10, 15, 50 years. Nuh-uh. It may seem as if only recently the stupid people somehow all gained enough money to travel somehow to the major cities of the world, where they somehow intuitively know where the most crowded spots on the most crowded sidewalks are, and stand there for hours and simply stare at the tall buildings, because evidently where they live, they do not have tall buildings, or buildings of any kind, or sidewalks. This idea that this is new is palpably untrue. As James Thurber will explain, all this happened no later than October 2nd, 1937, when he published in The New Yorker his saga of one of these international travelers who he met in the Lake Country of England, where she was complaining to him that Macbeth by Shakespeare was unbearably bad because it did not follow the rules of suspense paperbacks, like in the later, Mickey Spillane stories. The woman who believed Shakespeare fingered the wrong murderer in Macbeth, coming up on Fridays with Thurber. First, there are still many more new idiots to talk about in the daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's worst poisons in the world. The bronze? Well, we've already invoked the Yankees, so why not the New York Mets? Specifically, New York Mets radio. Now, I'm a Mets fan, and I'm delighted they beat the Phillies and will begin the National League Championship Series on Sunday, and maybe we will have a World Series in New York for the first time since 2015. I like going to the World Series. It's fun. I'm even glad that when Mets relief pitcher Edwin Roller Coaster Diaz came in the ninth inning of the deciding game with a 3-run lead and then walked the first two men that he faced and then steered out of the skid, and the Mets won, I'm delighted for Mets playman Howie Rose, who was in the press box in the first game I ever covered as a full-time professional network radio reporter in New York in 1979. It was the Mets and the Phillies, just like this game I'm talking about now. Howie was at dinner with me in the press room the first time I covered a New York Knicks game at Madison Square Garden as a pro a few months later. Howie and I go back. But as the pitcher Diaz entered the game, his appearance was somehow sponsored by an advertiser. And not only was there a radio commercial for it, but my friend Howie Rose had to read this commercial live. The commercial, as the relief pitcher warmed up, was for a suction device that is designed to prevent you from choking. As the relief pitcher is entering the game in the final inning of the series-deciding contest, a device to keep you from gagging? I mean, right then? Not in the second inning, but in the ninth inning, at the moment the disaster-prone relief pitcher enters the game. I mean, why not just say, "Worried you might choke like Edwin Diaz?" As we used to say in a different context, gah! The runner-up, speaking of, getting all the oxygen cut off, there's Kari Lake. Her debate against Ruben Gallego in the Arizona Senate race is over now, and frankly, so is she. If you've ever asked yourself, is this lady strung out or something? I think you now have your answer. Or in this case, answers. 2 of them.
First of all, I'm astounded that he actually knows the difference between a woman and a man, because I thought there were, 147 different genders. I do care about women's rights. I come from a family of women, and I have a daughter of my own and many nieces and nephews. I want to make sure that UVF is protected. I have many friends who are here. They're my friends today because of UVF. And I have many of my friends who have had children and experienced the joy of motherhood and parenthood because of UVF.
To take those in reverse order, UVF? Now, everybody thinks she meant IVF, in vitro fertilization, but of course, she could have also meant UHF, ultra-high frequency television like Channel 45 in Phoenix. I mean, Lake used to do TV. Or maybe she meant SPF, as in sunscreen, which, if you've ever seen one of her interviews, when one of the 6 camera filters she uses has broken, it's clear she could have used more of. Pro tip for the Republicans, never run the weekend weather person as your candidate for anything other than maybe weekday weather person. She sounds good. She has no idea what she's saying. As to the other answer about the male nieces, I don't know what to tell you, but it sure seems like that moderator's next question to Kari Lake should have been, to borrow one of the far-right's self-martyrdom catchphrases, what is a woman? Nephews and nieces are women. But our winner, the New York Times. Expect the world. All the news that's fit to print. When they actually questioned Trump's mental problems Monday, we should have seen this coming no later than Friday. Analysis. In interviews, Kamala Harris continues to bob and weave. Her media swing showed how she often responds to uncomfortable questions by acknowledging them, yet not fully answering them. In remarks about migrants, Donald Trump invoked his long-held fascination with genes and genetics. The Harris story noted that sometimes she answers questions directly, but sometimes she doesn't. This is news because apparently the New York Times fires all its writers and headline composers and editors every year or two, so that everything that happened, that also happened last year and the year before that and the decade before that, and in fact happened in the year 1867, all that seems fresh and new to all the new editors and writers and headline writers. Oh golly, a politician didn't completely answer my question. That's against the law, isn't it? Well, at least we should all mock her, but not Trump, because he does it every day, every hour, and every question. So that's not news anymore, right? That's the way it works. If it's happened 1,000 times, it's not news. If it just happened once, it's news. He's done it already. See how this works? The headline about, in remarks about migrants, Donald Trump invoked his long-held fascination with genes and genetics, is the Times reverting to sane-washing Trump's latest madness when he said that murdering people is genetic. It's in the genes, and especially it's genetic in migrants coming to this country. And we've got a lot of bad genes in this country. And he's talking about eugenics, about ruling people out of staying here or maybe incarcerating them or worse based on their racial history. It's Hitler. It's not fascination with genes and genetics. He is, of course, criminally insane. But the New York Times is, in fact, even more criminally insane than is Trump. That headline is the equivalent of, to apply it to Trump's fictional role model, in remarks about census takers, Hannibal Lecter invoked his long-held fascination with fava beans and a nice Chianti. Or, to send it back to its source, in headlines about Trump, the New York Times invoked its long-held fascination with seeing what would happen to America if it went fascist and a dictator decided to shut down the free press and jail everybody at the New York Times. This, on the part of what is nominally the nation's leading news organization, is not just perverse and petulant and stupid and anti-journalistic, it's suicidal. Nobody's asking for the Times to openly campaign against Donald Trump or for Kamala Harris or anybody else, but the desire to make it seem as if this manifestly insane man is just the equivalent of a pyromaniac who likes to see how well his own clothes will burn and therefore is fascinated with heating devices is at the heart of this. Once again, I will note that the best summary of where we stand with Trump comes from a New York Times article and a quote from the Yale historian Tim Snyder. Trump is in the classic dictatorial position. He needs to die in bed holding all executive power to stay out of prison. This means that he will do whatever he can to gain power, and once in power will do all that he can to never let it go. This is a basic incentive structure which underlies everything else. It is entirely inconsistent with democracy. In point of fact, what Tim Snyder said there should be the Times headline on every article it writes about Trump. Or, as whoever wrote that Trump invoked his long-held fascination with genes and genetics headline, Trump invoked his long-held fascination with serving America, along with fava beans and a nice Chianti. The New York Times. Hitler invoked his long-held fascination with significant rebuilding programs for European cities. Today's worst persons in the world! Fridays with Thurber and the works of the master, and one I have not read to you here before, but is one of my favorites because it is, well, you'll hear. Fridays with Thurber and the Macbeth Murder Mystery by James Thurber. It was a stupid mistake to make, said the American woman I had met at my hotel in the English Lake Country. But it was on the counter with the other Penguin books, the little sixpenny ones, you know, with the paper covers. And I supposed, of course, it was a detective story. All the others were detective stories. I'd read all the others. So I bought this one without really looking at it carefully. You can imagine how mad I was when I found it was Shakespeare. I murmured something sympathetically. I don't see why the Penguin books people had to get out Shakespeare's plays in the same size and everything as the detective stories, went on my companion. I think they have different colored jackets, I said. Well, I didn't notice that, she said. Anyway, I got real comfy in bed that night and all ready to read a good mystery story, and here I had The Tragedy of Macbeth, a book for high school students, like Ivanhoe. Or Lorna Doone, I said. Exactly, said the American lady. And I was just crazy for a good Agatha Christie or something. Hercule Poirot is my favorite detective. Is he the rabbity one? I asked. Oh, no, said my crime fiction expert. He's the Belgian one. You're thinking of Mr. Pinkerton, the one that helps Inspector Bull. He's good, too. Over her second cup of tea, my companion began to tell me the plot of a detective story that had fooled her completely. It seems it was the old family doctor all the time. But I cut in on her. Tell me, I said, did you read Macbeth? I had to read it, she said. There wasn't a scrap of anything else to read in the whole room. Did you like it? I asked. No, I did not, she said decisively. In the first place, I don't think for a moment that Macbeth did it. I looked at her blankly. Did what? I asked. I don't think for a moment that he killed the king, she said. I don't think the Macbeth woman was mixed up in it either. You suspect them the most, of course, but those are the ones that are never guilty or shouldn't be anyway. I'm afraid, I began, that But don't you see, said the American lady, it would spoil everything if you could figure out right away who did it. Shakespeare was too smart for that. I've read that people never have figured out Hamlet, so it isn't likely Shakespeare would have made Macbeth as simple as it seems. I thought this over while I filled my pipe. Who do you suspect? I asked suddenly. Macduff, she said promptly. Good God, I whispered softly. Oh, Macduff did it all right, said the murder specialist. Hercule Poirot would have gotten him easily. How did you figure it out? I demanded. Well, she said, I didn't right away. At first I suspected Banquo. And then, of course, he was the second person killed. That was good right in there, that part. The person you suspect of the first murder should always be the second victim. Is that so? I murmured. Oh, yes, said my informant. They have to keep surprising you. Well, after the second murder, I didn't know who the killer was for a while. How about Malcolm and Donalbain, the king's sons? I asked. As I remember it, they fled right after the first murder. That looks suspicious. Too suspicious, said the American lady. Much too suspicious. When they flee, they're never guilty. You can count on that. I believe, I said, I'll have a brandy, and I summoned the waiter. My companion leaned toward me, her eyes bright, her teacup quivering. Do you know who discovered Duncan's body? She demanded. I said I was sorry, but I had forgotten. Macduff discovers it, she said, slipping into the historical present. Then he comes running downstairs and shouts, Confusion has broke open the Lord's anointed temple, and sacrilegious murder has made his masterpiece, and on like that. The good lady tapped me on the knee. All that stuff was rehearsed, she said. You wouldn't say a lot of stuff like that offhand, would you, if you'd found a body? She fixed me with a glittering eye. I began. You're right, she said. You wouldn't unless you had practiced it in advance. My God, there's a body in here, is what an innocent man would say. She sat back with a confident glare. I thought for a while. But what do you make of the third murderer? I asked. You know, the third murderer has puzzled Macbeth's scholars for 300 years. That's because they never thought of Macduff, said the American lady. It was Macduff, I'm certain. You couldn't have one of the victims murdered by two ordinary thugs. The murderer always has to be somebody important. But what about the banquet scene? I asked after a moment. How do you account for Macbeth's guilty actions there when Banquo's ghost came in and sat in his chair? The lady leaned forward and tapped me on the knee again. There wasn't any ghost, she said. A big, strong man like that doesn't go around seeing ghosts, especially in a brightly lighted banquet hall with dozens of people around. Macbeth was shielding somebody. Who was he shielding? I asked. Mrs. Macbeth, of course, she said. He thought she did it, and he was going to take the rap himself. The husband always does that when the wife is suspected. But what, I demanded, about the sleepwalking scene then? The same thing, only the other way around, said my companion. That time, she was shielding him. She wasn't asleep at all. Do you remember where it says, enter Lady Macbeth with a taper? Yes, I said. Well, people who walk in their sleep never carry lights, said my fellow traveler. They have a second sight. Did you ever hear of a sleepwalker carrying a light? No, I said, I never did. Well, then she wasn't asleep. She was acting guilty to shield Macbeth. I think, I said, I'll have another brandy, and I called the waiter. When he brought it, I drank it rapidly and rose to go. I believe, I said, that you have got hold of something. Would you lend me that Macbeth? I'd like to look it over tonight. I don't feel somehow as if I've ever really read it. I'll get it for you, she said, but you'll find that I'm right. I read the play over carefully that night, and the next morning after breakfast I sought out the American woman. She was on the putting green, and I came up behind her silently and took her arm. She gave an exclamation. Could I see you alone? I asked in a low voice. She nodded cautiously and followed me to a secluded spot. You found out something, she breathed. I've found out, I said triumphantly, the name of the murderer. You mean it wasn't Macduff? She said. Macduff is as innocent of those murders, I said, as Macbeth and the Macbeth woman. I opened the copy of the play which I had with me and turned to Act 2, Scene 2. Here, I said, you will see where Lady Macbeth says, I laid their daggers ready, he could not miss 'em. Had he not resembled my father as he slept, I had done it. Do you see? No, said the American woman bluntly. I don't. But it's simple, I exclaimed. I wonder I didn't see it years ago. The reason Duncan resembled Lady Macbeth's father as he slept is that it actually was her father. Good God, breathed my companion softly. Lady Macbeth's father killed the king, I said, and hearing someone coming, thrust the body under the bed and crawled into the bed himself. But, said the lady, you can't have a murderer who only appears in the story once. You can't have that. I know that, I said, and I turned to Act 2, Scene 4. It says here, enter Ross with an old man. Now, that old man is never identified, and it is my contention that he was old Mr. Macbeth, whose ambition it was to make his daughter queen. There, you have your motive. But even then, cried the American lady, he's still a minor character. Not, I said gleefully, when you realize that he was also one of the weird sisters in disguise. You mean one of those 3 witches? Precisely, I said. Listen to this speech of the old man's. On Tuesday last, a falcon, towering in her pride of place, was by a mousing owl hawked at and killed. Who does that sound like? It sounds like the way the 3 witches talk, said my companion reluctantly. Precisely, I said again. Well, said the American woman, maybe you're right, but I'm sure I am, I said. And do you know what I'm going to do now? No, she said. What? Buy a copy of Hamlet, I said, and solve that. My companion's eyes brightened. Then, she said, you don't think Hamlet did it? I am, I said. Absolutely positive he did not. But who? She demanded. Who do you suspect? I looked at her cryptically. Everybody, I said, and disappeared into a small grove of trees as silently as I had come. The Macbeth Murder Mystery by James Thurber. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. We're now back to 5 episodes a week. We post nightly just after midnight Eastern. Follow me for the podcast promo videos. on TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter X, Instagram, and Instacart, oddly enough. Once again, there is a Monday countdown. Please send this podcast to somebody who does not know that they need to listen but needs to listen. Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel, the musical directors of Countdown, arranged, produced, and performed most of our music. Mr. Chanel handled orchestration and keyboards. Mr. Ray was on the guitars, bass, and drums, and it was produced by TKO Brothers. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by the best baseball stadium organist ever, Nancy Faust. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. Other music arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. My announcer today was my friend Larry David. Everything else was pretty much my fault. That's Countdown for today, 3 weeks and 4 days until the 2024 presidential election, and the 1,375th day since convicted felon Dementia J. Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the election, use the mental health system, use presidential immunity if we have to do it that way to keep him from doing it again. Well, we still can. The next scheduled countdown is Monday. Bulletins as the news requires. Until then, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.